"I'm just a waitress," the waitress whispered. The customers laughed and said, "Pick it up." She asked, "Why are you doing this entertainment?" The annoyed customer said, "I demand better service." Mafia Boss immediately retorted, "You paid for a meal, not for the right to decide someone else's worth." After saying that, he turned to the maid and said, "You need to put those down." "No, I need this," the girl said. But the boss continued to advise her, "Your self-respect is more important." "Okay." And the black maid agreed and thanked her master. They told her to say she was nothing, and for a moment, she almost believed it. Naomi Brooks kept her eyes down as the laughter rolled across the dining room, soft at first, then louder, sharper, echoing off glass and polished marble like it belonged there more than she did. The bills hit her shoulder, then her cheek, crumpled and careless, drifting to the floor at her feet as if even gravity had no respect for her tonight. And somewhere behind the laughter, a phone camera lifted, its tiny red light blinking, capturing every second of her humiliation like it was entertainment worth sharing. She inhaled slowly, the scent of expensive wine and buttered steak filling her lungs, a world she served but would never belong to. And when her manager's voice cut through the noise, low, tight, urging compliance, she felt the last thread of resistance inside her begin to fray. Because rent was overdue, because her little brother's medication wasn't optional, because dignity didn't come with a paycheck. Her fingers trembled as she bent down, the fabric of her uniform brushing against the cold floor, gathering the scattered bills one by one while the table above her watched like she was part of the menu, something to be consumed and forgotten. And then came the words that settled heavier than anything else, spoken with a smile that didn't need to shout to be cruel. "Say it," the man insisted, leaning back in his chair like he owned more than just the table. "Say you're nothing." And for a second, just a second, the entire room seemed to pause, waiting, listening, feeding off the moment as if silence itself had a price. Naomi swallowed, her throat tight, her reflection faint in the polished edge of a nearby wine glass, a version of herself she barely recognized, smaller somehow, quieter, almost erased, and when she opened her mouth, the words hovered there, fragile, dangerous, ready to fall. In the far corner of the room, a man who had said nothing all night set his glass down with a soft, deliberate sound that somehow cut through everything, his posture shifting just enough to break the rhythm of the scene, unnoticed by most, but not by the ones who understood power when it moved. Naomi didn't see him yet, didn't know that something had already changed, that the air itself was beginning to tighten, but she felt it, a subtle shift. Like the moment before a storm decides it's done waiting. And just as her voice began to form the first syllable, the chair in that corner scraped quietly against the floor, and someone stood up, and in that instant, the laughter didn't stop. It faltered, like it had suddenly remembered it wasn't in control anymore. The man did not raise his voice, and that was the first thing Naomi noticed, even before she dared to lift her eyes from the floor, because in a room filled with noise, true authority never needed to compete with it. His footsteps were steady, unhurried, each one measured against the polished marble as if the space itself belonged to him. And slowly, almost unwillingly, the laughter thinned out, fading into uncertain glances and shifting postures. The kind people make when they realize they may have misjudged something important. Naomi's fingers tightened around the crumpled bills in her hand, her heart pounding against her ribs as she remained kneeling, unsure whether to finish standing or disappear completely, because moments like this could go either way, and she had learned not to expect rescue in places like this. The phone that had been recording her humiliation was still raised, but its owner hesitated now, thumb hovering over the screen as the man approached, his presence quiet but undeniable, like a shadow that carried weight. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Naomi could see the edge of his shoes, polished but not flashy, the kind chosen by someone who did not need attention to command it, and for a brief second, no one spoke. Not the guests, not the manager, not even Naomi herself. Then the man reached out, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a calm precision, and gently lowered the phone from the guest's hand, his gaze never leaving the person in front of him, and though his expression remained composed, there was something in his eyes that shifted the balance of the room entirely. "That is enough," he said, his voice even, controlled, yet carrying a finality that settled into the air like a closed door. And suddenly the man who had been laughing moments ago straightened in his chair, his confidence thinning into something less certain, something more cautious. Naomi finally looked up, just slightly, her vision catching the outline of the stranger's face, strong features, unreadable, and for a fleeting moment she wondered why he felt different from the others, why his presence did not carry the same dismissiveness she had grown used to, but something steadier, something grounded, behind him. The manager rushed forward, his tone quick, almost nervous now, trying to smooth over what had already broken. But the man did not turn to him immediately, did not acknowledge the interruption as if it mattered, and that silence spoke louder than any reprimand could have. Naomi's breath caught as she realized the room was no longer watching her. It was watching him, waiting, measuring, recalibrating everything they thought they understood just seconds ago, and the weight of that shift pressed against her chest in a way she could not explain. The stranger then turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at the manager, and though the movement was small, it carried something absolute, something that made the manager stop mid-sentence, his words dissolving before they could fully form, and in that suspended moment, Naomi understood something without anyone saying it aloud, that this man did not belong to the crowd, and more importantly, the crowd did not outrank him. The manager forced a strained smile, stepping closer now, his voice carefully measured as if trying to reclaim control of something that was already slipping through his fingers. "Sir, I assure you, everything is under control," he said, but the words landed weak, almost hollow, because the room no longer believed him. The man did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched, deliberate, making every second feel longer than it should, until he finally turned fully toward the manager. His gaze steady, unblinking, the kind that did not ask for attention but commanded it without effort. Naomi slowly rose to her feet, still clutching the bills in her hand, unsure where to look, unsure where she belonged in this shifting moment, because for the first time that night, she was no longer invisible, and that realization was just as unsettling as the humiliation had been. The guest who had thrown the money shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, attempting to laugh it off. But the sound died halfway, swallowed by the tension that now filled the room, and even the other diners who had been watching with quiet amusement now avoided eye contact, as if distance could erase their part in what had just happened. The man's voice came again, calm but unmistakably firm. "You call this under control?" he asked, not raising his tone, yet every word carried weight, pressing against the manager's composure until it began to crack. The manager hesitated, glancing briefly at the table of guests, then back at the man, calculating, uncertain, caught between loyalty to customers and something he could not quite define but clearly feared. Naomi's heart raced as she watched the exchange, her mind struggling to understand why everything had changed so quickly, why one quiet voice had silenced a room that moments ago had felt unstoppable. The man took a single step closer, not threatening, not aggressive, but purposeful, closing the distance just enough to make the manager instinctively straighten, his confidence shrinking into compliance without a word being demanded. "She works here," the man continued, his tone even as if stating something obvious, yet somehow more significant than it sounded. And Naomi felt those words settle over her, unfamiliar and heavy, because no one had said them like that before. No one had made her role feel like it carried weight instead of shame. The manager nodded quickly. "Too quickly? Of course, sir," "She does," he replied, but his voice had changed now, stripped of authority, replaced by something closer to caution. The man's gaze shifted briefly to Naomi, not lingering, not invasive, but enough for her to feel seen in a way that was neither pity nor judgment. And for a fleeting moment, she felt something steady beneath the chaos, something that did not ask her to shrink. Then he turned back to the manager, and in that subtle movement, the balance of power in the room shifted completely, because whatever came next would not be decided by laughter, or money, or status, but by him. And everyone in that room knew it, even if they could not yet explain why. The manager's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out, because the question was not really a question, it was a line being drawn, and everyone in the room felt it. Naomi stood still, her fingers slowly loosening around the wrinkled bills, her breathing uneven as she tried to steady herself, because for the first time that night, the weight pressing down on her chest had shifted, not gone, but moved, like someone had quietly stepped in and taken part of it without asking. The guest who had started everything leaned forward again, forcing a thin smile, attempting to regain control of a moment that was no longer his. "Look, we were just having a little fun," he said, his tone lighter now, almost defensive, but the laughter he expected did not return, because no one was willing to stand with him anymore. The man's gaze moved to him, slow and deliberate, and that single glance was enough to silence whatever came next, because it was not anger in his eyes. It was something colder, something that measured rather than reacted. "Fun," the man repeated quietly, as if testing the word, and the way he said it stripped it of any comfort it might have carried before. Naomi felt her heartbeat echo in her ears as she watched, her mind racing with questions she could not ask, because nothing about this situation made sense. Not the sudden shift, not the way the room had changed sides without a word being spoken, not the way this stranger seemed to understand something no one else did. The manager finally cleared his throat, trying again. "Sir, perhaps we can resolve this privately," he suggested, his voice lower now, cautious. But the man did not move, did not step back, did not give the situation an escape route. Instead, he reached out slightly, not toward the guest, not toward the manager, but toward Naomi's hand, and without touching her, he gestured toward the money she still held. His expression unchanged. "You dropped something," he said, his tone neutral, yet the meaning behind it was anything but. And Naomi froze, her eyes flickering between the bills and his face, unsure what he was asking of her, unsure what she was allowed to do. For a second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, watching, as if this small moment carried more weight than everything that had come before it. Slowly, carefully, Naomi straightened her posture, her shoulders lifting just slightly as she looked down at the money, then back up, and something inside her shifted, subtle but real, because no one had ever framed her dignity as something that could not be traded, not even for survival. The guest scoffed softly, shaking his head. "It is just cash," he muttered. But his voice lacked conviction now, because the room no longer agreed with him. The man's eyes did not leave Naomi as he spoke again. "Then it should not be difficult to let it go," he said, calm and final. And in that moment, the decision was no longer about money, or embarrassment, or even the job she needed to keep. It was about something deeper, something she had been forced to ignore for too long. And as Naomi slowly opened her hand, letting the crumpled bills fall back onto the table instead of into her pocket, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with understanding, and no one in that room could pretend they did not feel it. The sound of the bills landing back on the table was soft, almost insignificant, yet it echoed louder than the laughter that had filled the room minutes earlier, because this time no one reacted, no one reached for a joke, no one dared to break the silence that had settled like a quiet verdict. Naomi's hand remained open for a moment longer than necessary, as if letting go of more than just paper, and when she finally lowered it, her posture had changed in a way that even she did not fully understand. Her shoulders no longer folding inward, her gaze no longer fixed on the floor. The man watched her without interruption, his expression unchanged. But there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something almost approving. Though it was not given freely, it was earned in that small, deliberate act. Across the table, the guest shifted again, his confidence now reduced to irritation, his voice sharper as he tried to reclaim ground that had already been lost. "This is ridiculous," he said, glancing toward the manager as if expecting support. "I am a paying customer, and this whole scene is unnecessary." But the manager did not immediately respond. His attention caught between the man in front of him and the reality forming around him, one he could not afford to ignore. The stranger finally turned toward the guest, his movements calm, controlled, and when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, only clarity. "You paid for a meal," he said evenly, "not for the right to decide someone else's worth." And the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed, because they were not loud, they were certain. Naomi felt them more than she heard them, felt them settle somewhere deep inside her where doubt had lived for too long, and for a brief second. She forgot about the cameras, the customers, the consequences, because something more important had just been said out loud. The guest let out a short laugh, but it lacked conviction, his eyes flickering around the room as if searching for agreement that never came. And that absence of support spoke louder than any argument could have. The manager stepped forward again, slower this time, more careful. "Sir, perhaps we should move this conversation," he began. But the stranger raised his hand slightly, not to silence him forcefully, but to pause him. And that small gesture was enough. The manager stopping mid-step as if reminded of something he had momentarily forgotten. Naomi watched closely now, no longer shrinking away, her attention fixed on the man who had changed everything without raising his voice. And she realized that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it revealed itself in moments like this, when no one expected it. The stranger's gaze moved once more across the room, taking in the faces, the reactions, the silence. And then back to the manager. "You allow this here?" he asked quietly. And it was not a question seeking information, it was a question demanding accountability, one that could not be answered with excuses or deflection. The manager hesitated, his expression tightening as the weight of the moment settled fully onto him, because whatever he said next would define more than just this situation, it would define his place in it. And as the seconds stretched, the room waited, not for noise, not for conflict, but for truth. And no one moved, no one spoke, because everyone understood that something irreversible had just begun. The manager's silence stretched just long enough to confirm what everyone in the room was beginning to understand, that this was no longer a situation he could smooth over with polite words or forced smiles. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by something quieter, something closer to admission. "No, sir," he said carefully. "It should not be allowed." And the shift in tone was immediate, subtle yet undeniable, because in that moment, he was no longer defending the scene, he was distancing himself from it. The guest let out a sharp breath, disbelief flashing across his face as he leaned back in his chair, his posture stiffening. "You are taking this too far," he said, but the edge in his voice had dulled, no longer commanding attention, no longer setting the tone. And for the first time that night, he sounded like someone reacting instead of controlling. Naomi stood still, her hands now empty at her sides, her chest rising and falling more evenly as she watched the balance of power continue to shift, her mind struggling to keep up with how quickly everything had changed, because just minutes ago she had been the center of ridicule, and now she was standing in a silence that demanded respect. The man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if the manager's answer had confirmed something he already knew. And when he spoke again, his words were precise, measured, leaving no room for interpretation. "Then fix it," he said, not as a suggestion, not as a request, but as a simple directive. And the weight behind those two words settled over the manager instantly. The manager straightened, his shoulders pulling back as if remembering his role. But this time the authority he carried was not his own. It was borrowed, shaped by the presence of the man standing in front of him. And he turned toward Naomi first, his expression shifting into something unfamiliar. Something closer to respect than obligation. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice steady but softened. "I apologize," and the words landed in the room with a quiet finality, because they were not expected, not from him, not here, not in front of everyone. Naomi blinked, caught off guard, her name sounding different when spoken like that, when it was not attached to an order or a correction, but to an acknowledgement. And for a moment she did not respond, not because she did not hear him, but because she was not used to being addressed that way. The manager continued, turning slightly toward the table of guests, his tone firm now, no longer wavering. "This behavior is not acceptable," he said, each word deliberate, and though he did not raise his voice, it carried across the room, filling the space where laughter had once been. The guest's expression hardened, but he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would restore what he had lost. Not here, not now. Naomi felt something settle inside her, something steady and unfamiliar. Not relief, not entirely, but something close, something that felt like being seen without being diminished. And as she glanced briefly toward the man who had made all of this possible, she realized that he had not stepped forward to create a scene. He had stepped forward to end one, and in doing so, he had changed more than just a moment. He had changed the way the room itself understood what was acceptable and what was not. The apology did not end the moment, it transformed it, because what had been tension did not disappear. It deepened into something heavier, something more deliberate, and Naomi felt it settle into the room as every eye shifted, no longer searching for entertainment but for resolution. The guest who had once commanded attention now sat rigid, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, a restless habit that betrayed the control he no longer had. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, restrained. "This is unnecessary," he muttered. But the words lacked the certainty they once carried, because no one moved to support him. No one laughed, no one even nodded. The manager remained still, his stance firm now, no longer caught between sides. And that quiet alignment made the difference clear, because this was no longer a disagreement. It was a correction. Naomi stood in place, her breathing steady, her shoulders squared in a way that felt unfamiliar but right. And though she said nothing, her silence was no longer submission, it was presence. The man who had intervened shifted his attention once more, his gaze passing briefly over the surrounding tables, noting the stillness, the lowered voices, the absence of distraction, and then returning to the center of it all, as if confirming that the room had understood what had just been rewritten. "You are finished here," he said calmly, addressing the guest, and though the sentence was simple, it carried an authority that did not invite debate, only response. The guest looked up, surprise flickering across his face, followed quickly by resistance, but it faded just as fast, because something in the man's tone made it clear that this was not a suggestion, not a negotiation, but a boundary. Chairs shifted quietly as the other diners avoided looking directly at the table, not out of indifference, but out of recognition. Because everyone present understood that a line had been crossed and then redrawn. The guest exhaled slowly, pushing his chair back with controlled movement, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful composure, the kind people adopt when they realize the room no longer belongs to them. And without another word, he stood, adjusting his jacket as if trying to recover a sense of dignity that had already slipped away. Naomi watched, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a quiet awareness that something irreversible had just occurred. Not just for him, but for her as well. The manager stepped aside, allowing the exit without obstruction, his posture respectful, his role now clear, and as the guest walked past, the room remained silent, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The man remained where he stood, unmoved, his presence steady, and for a moment longer. Nothing happened. No applause, no commentary. Just the stillness of a space that had been forced to remember its own boundaries. And in that stillness, Naomi realized that what had changed was not just how she was seen, but how she would allow herself to be seen from this moment forward. The door closed softly behind the departing guest, and the sound lingered longer than it should have, as if the room needed a final confirmation that the moment had truly ended. Yet no one moved, no one spoke, because something deeper than a simple confrontation had taken place. Naomi remained where she stood, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture steady, and for the first time since she had walked into her shift that evening, she did not feel the need to shrink, did not feel the pressure to disappear into the background, and that absence of fear felt unfamiliar, almost fragile, like something she had to learn how to hold. The manager turned back toward her, his expression no longer rushed or defensive, but thoughtful, measured, as if he was seeing her for the first time beyond her uniform, beyond her role. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a sincerity that had been missing before. "You may take a moment," he said quietly, not as an order, but as permission, and Naomi nodded slightly, not stepping away, but acknowledging the shift around them. The other diners slowly returned to their meals, though their movements were different now, more subdued, more aware, as if the room itself had been reset, its boundaries redrawn in a way that could not be undone. The man who had intervened remained still for a moment longer, his gaze lingering not on the people, but on the space itself, as if confirming that what needed to change had already begun. And then, without announcement, without seeking attention, he turned slightly, preparing to leave just as quietly as he had stood up. Naomi's eyes followed him, her thoughts racing with questions she could not voice, because nothing about him fit into the world she understood, not the way he moved, not the way he spoke, not the way the room had responded to him without hesitation as he took a step away. The manager straightened instinctively, his posture shifting into something more formal, more precise, and in a lowered voice, almost careful not to disturb the air, he said, "Mr. Kane." And the name landed softly, yet it carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation, the kind that was recognized rather than introduced. Naomi's breath caught slightly, the name repeating in her mind as pieces began to align, subtle details that suddenly made sense. The way the staff had avoided certain corners of the room, the way the manager had faltered, the way silence had followed him like it belonged to him. Sebastian Kane paused just briefly, not turning fully, but enough to acknowledge the address, and in that small motion, the final layer of the moment revealed itself, because he was not just a guest, not just an observer, but the one person in the room who did not need permission to decide how things would end. Naomi felt the realization settle into her chest, not as fear, but as clarity, because everything that had happened was not random. It was chosen, deliberate. And as Sebastian continued toward the exit, his presence receding without fanfare, the room remained quiet, not out of tension this time, but out of respect. And Naomi stood there, understanding that she had just witnessed something rare, something that did not happen every day, a moment where dignity was not defended loudly, but restored completely, and nothing in that room would ever feel quite the same again. The door had already closed, yet the presence he left behind lingered in a way Naomi could not explain, as if the air itself remembered who had just passed through it. And for a long moment she remained still, standing in the middle of a room that felt both familiar and entirely different. The clinking of silverware slowly returned. Quiet conversations resumed in softened tones, but nothing sounded the same, because something unspoken had shifted beneath it all. Something that could not be undone. Naomi exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling with a steadiness she had not felt before. And when she finally moved, it was not with hesitation, not with the careful steps of someone trying to avoid attention, but with a quiet confidence that came from understanding her place had never been as small as others made it seem. The manager approached again, this time without urgency, without pressure, stopping at a respectful distance as if unsure how to bridge the gap that had just been revealed. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low, sincere, and Naomi nodded once, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement, because she knew the moment did not belong to him, and it did not fully belong to her either. It belonged to the choice that had been made when she refused to bend. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the entrance, half expecting to see him still there, but he was gone, leaving no trace except the silence he had carved into the room and the understanding he had left behind. A server nearby adjusted a tray, glancing at Naomi with a look that held something new, something closer to respect than indifference. And she realized that the change was not just internal, it was visible, it was shared. It had spread quietly through the room without needing to be announced. Naomi picked up her order pad again, the familiar weight grounding her. But even that felt different now, not because the job had changed, but because she had. And as she moved between tables, her steps were measured, her posture upright, her presence undeniable in a way it had never been before. The memory of the crumpled bills on the table lingered in her mind, not as shame, but as a turning point, a moment where something had been tested and something stronger had answered. And she understood now that dignity was not something given by others. It was something protected, even when the cost felt too high. The manager returned to his station, his movements more deliberate, more aware, as if he too had learned something he could not ignore. And the rest of the staff followed suit. Small changes in posture, in tone, in the way they carried themselves, subtle but real. Outside, the night carried on as it always did. Cars passing, lights flickering against the glass. The world unchanged. Yet inside, something had been rewritten. Quietly. Permanently. Naomi paused for a brief second near the edge of the room, her gaze steady, her shoulders relaxed, and though no one spoke of what had happened, no one needed to, because the silence held it all, every word that had not been said, every line that had been redrawn, and as she turned to continue her shift, there was no hesitation left in her steps, only clarity, and somewhere beyond the walls, the man who had walked away without looking back had already moved on. But the impact of that moment remained, shaping everything it had touched. And that night, without ceremony, without applause, the room remembered what dignity looks like.